This is part 4 of my workbench build, and in the last video I built and installed the top. Today I'm picking up where I left off, starting with flattening the top. I'm using the router sled method to do this, and I won't go into a lot of detail about this process. There's already a couple of great videos out there on how to do this, and I'll leave links to those. The process itself isn't difficult, but it is messy and a little slow going. Luckily I had a beautiful day where I could open up the doors and get to it. I mentioned in the last video that I'm going with a bench dog design that Andy Klein developed. I'll leave a link to his video as well. The basics are, here I'm cutting 1/4-inch thick pieces of scrap to glue together into a sort of plywood for the dogs. I'm gluing up the stacks 4 high with an alternating grain direction. This should make for a nice strong head for the dogs. I did make sure that the top piece on each one was from the same piece of wood to keep the color variation to a minimum. Probably overkill for a bench, but at this point I can't stop myself from thinking that way. I had a lot of these to glue up, so I wrapped tape around each one and then stacked them in the clamps so that I could get several of them clamped at the same time. Once the glue cured, I was left with a bunch of square pegs that I had to fit in round holes. I used the same bit I drilled the dog holes with to make a template, and used that template to trace the circle onto the dogs, and then rough cut them out at the bandsaw. Before I cut them, I made a quick zero clearance surface to cut them on. The small pieces that I was cutting off could easily get jammed up in the standard insert which came with the bandsaw, which itself can create all kinds of problems. I used my belt sander to clean them up and take them back to the line and test fit them over at the bench a few times just to make sure they were just right. Somehow I didn't get footage of the jig I used to mark the centers on these, but I did, and then drilled a recess for the dog posts. After that, I drilled and tapped each one, which will make sense here in a little bit. Okay, everything I'm about to do next is now completely unnecessary. At the time, making the dog posts was the only option, but Andy has since started to sell kits for this style of bench dogs that includes a pre-made post. I've referenced his designs a couple times now, and I'll also be installing one of his vices in the next video, but I'm not receiving anything for that. I just think he's put out some great products, and I'm a fan. What I did to make these was to use 3/4-inch outside diameter pipe and some 3/8 threaded rod and nuts. That size worked perfectly because I could just hammer a nut into each end of the pipe and then thread the rod into place. I made sure the thread and nut were just slightly below the end of the pipe on the bottom, and I didn't worry about how far it protruded on the top, just that it was longer than what I needed. Next, I took the post over to my welding table and welded the bottom of the posts, pipe, nut, and threaded rod. There was no need to weld the top. Welding the bottom will keep everything together. I cleaned up my welds at the bench grinder and then chucked up each one in the drill press. I took them up to 220 grit and then coated them with some water-based poly to prevent rusting. Next, I could turn my attention back to the tops. I made a jig to hold the tops and cut a flat front onto each piece. It's important to note that I kept the offcut and also kept it paired with the top that it was cut from. I cleaned up the cuts on the belt sander and added a slight back bevel to the flat surface when I did it. I glued a piece of cork rubber to each top. When the bench dog is in the bench, this will take up the kerf left by the bandsaw cut in the sanding. The offcut gets glued into the bench, and the orientation is important. For my bench, I want all of the dogs in the bench to have the flat side facing the tail vise, and the dogs in the tail vise facing the bench. So the offcuts have to be glued up in the opposite direction. I hope that makes sense. After the glue cured, I threaded the posts into the tops, installed them in the bench, and then used a block plane to flush them up to the surface. Next up is the shelf. I started by ripping some pieces of scrap down to use as the shelf supports. I cut them to length and then cut a rabbet into each one. The material left proud will lock into the dados in those lower stretchers. I'm going to be installing the shelf supports with screws, just in case I want to remove or replace the shelf in the future. I drilled a couple of recessed holes in each support, then took them over to the bench to mark and drill pilot holes. The shelf will be made from solid wood planks, so I milled up some 4/4 material and cut the planks to size. I installed my dado blade and cut in some dados to make a shiplap out of the planks. This will allow for seasonal wood movement, which can be important since my garage is only partially climate controlled. The two outside planks need to have cutouts made for the legs. I used a stop and cut most of the way at the table saw, and then finished the cuts with a handsaw at the workbench. Each shelf is installed with one countersunk screw on each side. I used some spacers to make sure the gaps were all even, and then drilled the screw in the center of each side. With the shelves completed, I went ahead and applied the finish. I decided to go with Roubo on this bench, mostly for the simple application and repairability. I'm not a big fan of flatter finishes like you get from Roubo, but I can definitely see the appeal. It's not my go-to finish at this point, but I've been finding applications where it works out great, and this was one of them. At this point, I'm ready to move on to the sliding Deadman, but there were a couple things I did earlier in this build that are important to the Deadman now. First, I routed out a dado on the back side of the outside laminate on the bench top before I glued it up. This is to accept the top of the Deadman. I also cut a runner for the bottom of the Deadman by first cutting two 45-degree cuts and then a flat cut to remove the top of that chamfer. And then finally cutting the runner free from the board. Glued the runner to the front stretcher back before I installed the top. The runner is glued flush to the front of that stretcher so that the Deadman will ride all the way to the front. Okay, so I have the blank for my Deadman that I already cut down. This is 7 inches wide, and originally I was going for 21.5 total height, but when I actually went to fit it in, I realized that wasn't short enough at the top or cut in enough on the rabbet to be able to fit it up in. So I shortened it by 1/4 of an inch, seems to work perfect. So next I'm gonna lay everything out so that I can get the routing done and the dog holes drilled. One kind of unique thing I'm doing is adding a dovetail slot so that I can use a dovetail clamp. To do this, I also need to route a recess at the bottom of the dovetail slot to allow the clamp to be installed. I do that first, then route a 1/4 inch dado just to remove the bulk of the waste before routing with a dovetail bit. And there it is. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'll have one more video in this series coming out soon where I'll be installing the twin turbo vise and wrapping this one up.